Hello, this is Taylor Ellwood with Magical Experiments, and welcome. Please be sure to tap the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed and click the notification bell. You know the whole dance and rigmarole by now. And make sure you also comment if you're a frequent flyer here. It makes Taylor happy. I'm talking about myself in third person. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm a little bit of a maniac, so what do you expect? All right, so tonight we're going to talk about my approach to spirit work. And what prompted this is that I got a couple of questions, both in regards to the Can Pop Culture Spirits Die? And so I'm going to address each of those questions first, and then we're going to talk further here. So in the case of, I had on the YouTube video itself, I had a person observe that he agreed that spirits could die, but he didn't agree that they rely on us to exist. He said maybe servitors do, but I believe what being relevant does is give them presence in the physical, not necessarily existence. The spirit world has its own existence. And when a spirit is no longer present on the physical, they tend to go and live in the spirit world. Besides, all the spirits I work with can exist with or without me. Many of them are older than humanity itself. How do we explain the spirits who pre-exist, whose existence predates, if we believe their existence is dependent on our own? Existence is not a popularity contest. It's an interesting point. And it's a good counter argument to the one I made. So I liked it, and I'm not disagreeing with the guy's question at all. So here's my thoughts on this. First of all, keep in mind that anytime I make an argument on here or in any of my books, I'm not even always 100% on board with that argument. I like to present multiple perspectives. And the reason I like to do that is because I think it's useful to get people thinking. And sometimes those perspectives will get those kinds of comments. Is it possible that spirits predate humanity? More than likely, yes. What's interesting to consider then is, have those spirits adapted to humanity? And I would say that they perhaps have. And we see this, and this leads us to the second observation, which is one that a person made on my Facebook post about this. So I'm tying all this together, so stick with me here, please, because it is important. On the Facebook, my one friend, he let me see if I can find it. I had it there, and then of course it reloads the darn thing. It basically goes like this. He basically was talking about the humanocentric aspects of spirits, and that's how he relates to them. He was saying, and I'm just kind of pulling it up here now, almost there. And let's see here. Oh, geez, I might as well have done this whole thing. It takes forever to find the one I'm looking for. Oh, well. Geez, this is ridiculous. Okay, folks, I'm sorry for those of you who are watching this video. Unfortunately, I had it pulled up to where I wanted it to be, and then now I can't find it. Long and short of it is this. The person was talking about the fact that he worked with spirits from a humanocentric perspective. And what I shared with him is that there could be an alternative perspective to that. And his thoughts on that were, well, like, what would that actually look like? Here it is. I found it. So here he said it led him to the idea to treat spirits as ideas because of that we've given an anthropomorphic form. And I said that this was something that I thought was shared by many people. And he said that if he thought that a spirit is an amorphous intelligence that can interact with the world of matter directly, then he would expect it to do everything a person can do, but with fewer restraints, and that it hasn't been his experience. And I said, I wonder what if instead of anthropomorphizing the spirits in either way you've described, what if you were to try and approach them on their terms? And what does their own terms mean, was what he asked. And I said, well, Perhaps we're so focused on trying to have a relationship with spirits on our terms instead of trying to understand their perspective and how they experience our world and us. So here we are now. Okay, it took me a few moments to tie all that together, and if you stuck with me, I'm proud of you. The one person says, spirits possibly predate humanity. Not going to disagree with that. I think there's a good point to it. The other person says, I've taken a anthropomorphic approach to spirits as ideas because they don't seem to interact with the world very directly. I don't fully agree with that one. From my own experience with spirits, they can interact with the world very directly. I got that experience with Saturn in the summer, and with the way things got pulled together in my life in a number of ways. And it transformed my life in a huge way. And it transformed not just my life, but the lives of other people too, in some ways. So I don't know that that's entirely true. I think that spirits can interact with the world directly. But I think part of that is based on how we work with the spirits and how we approach them. And here's my thought on this. I think that to a certain extent, how we interact with spirits does play a role in our experience of them and what happens with them and whether or not we even limit them in some ways. Because let's go back to the original thing where I said, could pop culture spirits die? And then I said, could spirits die in general? Well, one person says, well, look, spirits have been around longer than humanity. And when you think about it, there's probably a lot of truth to that. I mean, we look at the creation stories, for example, and the spirits create the humans. So there's probably something to that, especially when you see it across the board. But the thing that always stands out to me, and this is a very crucial thing, is that even so, spirits interact with us. There's got to be some give and take there in my experience with spirits, like they interact with us, we interact with them. And I do think that spirits do get a distinctive advantage by working with us. They're able to interact with the world more directly through us. And this is where I think it comes into play that, you have spirits that will work through us. And sometimes they will take on anthropomorphic or humanocentric aspects because it's convenient as a way to work in the world. Now, in my book, Walking with Spirits, this little book here, one of the things I talk about is taking an experiential approach to spirits, one that is different from the classical traditional approaches. Traditional approaches you do have anthropomorphizing of the spirits. And this is whether you're worshiping them, whether you're summoning them and saying, hey, I want you to do something. And if you don't, I'm going to lay the smackdown on you. It's not entirely different from the co-relational approaches to spirits. Like Stephanie Connolly talks about co-relational or collaborative relationships with spirits in her books. And I highly recommend her books. She's a great author, great person too. But I think that when you look at a co-relational approach to spirits, one thing that is worth looking at is what are the parameters of that relationship? How have we set up that relationship? And how has the spirit set up that relationship? What are the expectations on both sides? Because there's no such thing as a relationship where there isn't some kind of parameter built into play. It may not be an obvious parameter, but there's always going to be parameters at work. Now, I think with the spirits, the kind of parameters that most people typically work with are the tendency to anthropomorphize spirits. Because let's be honest here, if I can anthropomorphize a spirit and the spirit shows up in a form that's familiar to me, it's easier to relate to that spirit and it's easier to connect with that spirit. But of course, there's some dangers that come with that, because what we're doing is that we're also filtering the spirit in a very specific way. And we're filtering the spirit in such a way that what we're doing is we're putting on our own human biases and interpretations of the spirit. This, in and of itself, is problematic because what it does is it builds into that relationship the very realistic limitations that we bring to the spirit, because what we're saying to the spirit is, I need you to show up a certain way. How much of that parameter are we consequently building into that relationship, and therefore separating out what the spirit actually could or couldn't do? Now, you might say, well, Taylor, how do you know for sure? Well, let's go back to my work with Saturn. This summer, I do Saturn workings. I did a couple of them. And the way that I worked with Saturn, I didn't really work with him in a humanocentric way. I didn't have an expectation as to how he would appear, or that he would have 5 baby godlings in his belly with a stone on the way in, or any of that stuff. My experience of him was very primal, temporal, and I'm not saying that he didn't perhaps choose to take on a form that I could relate to, because I think he did, because he knew that was what I could apprehend and work with. But nonetheless, I didn't build expectations into that. I tried to be very open to the experience, and a lot of the experience with Saturn was very much one of shall we say, raw temporal awareness, but also awareness of limitations, of the limits, the parameters of things, and how those can be applied to get results. And what he showed me definitely applied, transformed my life. So I think that if I had not approached Saturn that way, I could have limited him in a very substantial way. And it was really fascinating for me to recognize this, that in a very real sense, the work with Saturn was transformative work that shaped my experience of the way Saturn shows up. I was open to Saturn because I approached it from an experiential perspective, where I was trying not to put any filters into place. If there were filters there, and there probably were some, I was doing my best to be open to the experience and interpretation. And I think this is really crucial, because in your work with the spirits, they can show us perspectives we otherwise would miss out on if we filter them. So when I talk about experiential work with spirits, what I'm really talking about is being open to the experience of the spirit showing up in the way that it wants to show up, as opposed to the way that I want it to show up, and being open to communicating with the spirit in the way that the spirit wants to communicate, as opposed to the way I think the spirit ought to communicate. Because if we look at human interactions with spirits, what we typically see is, you're going to connect with me in the way that I want you to show up and communicate with me. And what I mean by that is, you're going to talk to me in my native language, whatever that is. You're going to show up in a humanocentric form. It may not be fully human, but it's going to be a form I can relate to. What expectations and filters and limitations are we building into that contact? This is the question people don't ask when they look at this kind of work. And thank you very much, Nick. I'm glad that you're enjoying the videos and my methods. Appreciate that. So if we really consider this from the perspective of the spirit work, right? What we get is this raw experience when we open ourselves up to no longer perceiving the spirit in the way that we expect to perceive it. No longer expecting communication the way that we expect it to be done. Now, some people would say, but Taylor, how do I know then that the spirits contacted me? Oh, that's a good question. This is where we have to turn toward cultivating our more subtle senses and awarenesses around things. Case in point. One of the things that I'm doing right now is I do a lot of Qigong, and one of the things that I've been working with is Bagua, which is a form of walking, Qigong walking. And when I'm doing that, I do it to connect with the elemental spirits of the area that I'm in. The act of walking and the act of opening my senses and awareness up to those spirits is where the communication happens. They don't appear to me in a human form. They don't talk to me in a human tongue. Nonetheless, there is communication and interaction occurring. This is also true with the spirit of a place. It's true with different types of spirits. Now, some spirits will, in my experience and opinion, they will prefer human language. I've noticed this with demons in particular. They like to take on human form and stuff. And I think part of that is because they actually find that to be more effective as a way to connect with people. Just my opinion. I could be wrong, but that's just it's based on my experience with them. But if I look at like my work with archangels or angelic forces or elemental spirits or nature spirits, what I find is that they tend to prefer a more raw, experiential flow of information, a transmission, if you will. And in my book, Walking with Spirits, which, yes, I'm going to flash here again. Hi. In that book, which incidentally, if you click on the link below, you can find that and the other book, Walking with Magical Entities. And eventually you'll see other books there too, because I'm working on like walking with elemental spirits right now, but there's going to be other ones anyway. All right. So anyway, getting back to the matter at hand, right? In Walking with Spirits, what I lay out is my model for working with spirits. And it's a model that is based on, and I call it a model, it's not really a model. It is an experiential approach to working with spirits that I'm setting up and creating as a way to interact with the spirits without the usual filters put into place. And through this work, I have found that the spirits have more of a direct impact, because what I'm doing is I am allowing them to work through me. I'm not filtering them. I'm not placing them into a very specific context. Instead, I'm allowing them to work through me and communicate with me directly, transmitting through me and with me, and becoming very much a medium for those spirits. Now, is this kind of work for anyone? I would say no. I think that doing this kind of work has its own risks. It definitely is something that I would say can change your perceptions quite a bit. It certainly has created an experience for myself that has been rough at times in terms of how I experience the world. And I think the more that I get into it, the more I realize that, this kind of work, it brings with it a certain level of obligation to the spirits that you work with. Like the work with Saturn has by no means been a cakewalk. I mean, it's been interesting, but there's very much a solid understanding that this is going to be ongoing work and that it's going to show up in different ways. I think that if we look at anthropomorphic approaches to working with spirits, they're quote unquote safer. And why do I say that? Because what happens is we filter those spirits down to a very specific context and relationship that is workable for us. And it's safer as a result. It's convenient. And when something is safer and convenient, guess what? We will always favor that kind of approach because it's convenient for us and it's safer and it gets us things that we want, but it also cuts out a lot of the things we could experience. So my approach is an alternative way, but what it requires is a willingness to open yourself up to working with the spirits in a manner that is distinctly different from what you will find in most Western systems of magic. Most Western systems of magic are built around creating very specific filtration and rules for how you work with spirits. Very convenient, very safe in a way, but also very limiting to the spirits. Whereas my approach is we're going to walk with the spirits. We're going to allow them in. We're going to create an experience with them. And we're going to embody that experience and mediate it out into the world at large. This is not something casually done. It's something that requires a level of commitment and understanding of what you are getting into when you relate to spirits that way. So I share that with you both to explain what the difference is between my book and, say, other books out there, because I'm approaching things from a very much an experiential perspective. And I won't say that my book is the only book out there on this topic. There's some books that I reference in there in it quite extensively that are very relevant. But I would say that in general, Western magic does not seem to approach spirit work in the same way that I do. Just based on what I have read and experienced over the years. And again, that's not a comment on it. It's just a simple fact that if you're going to do spirit work, right, you should really be ready and prepared to understand how the way a spirit shows up is in one form or another limited by you. Now, some people will say, well, you can't really limit spirits. And I'd say, well, yeah, there's some truth to that too. But in a very real sense, the spirits that you work with are going to recognize when those limits are going to benefit them. So like, let's say, like you say, hey, I want to work with the spirit, but I want to work with it in a humanocentric way, in an anthropomorphic way. Well, this is very convenient, isn't it? The spirit says, sure, why not? I get a bit more access to the world. Yeah, it limits me in some ways, but I'll do it. Or I come along and I say, hey, to that same spirit, I'll walk with you. I will experience you. And I will allow you to work through that experience into the world around me. And what I'm asking for in return is that you help me get some very real effects. Spirit's going to be like, yeah, I can do that. Can you handle it? Well, that's the question. Can a person handle it? This kind of work is not just for anyone, because it requires a willingness to suspend your own convenient rules for reality. And let's just be brutally honest here. People create rules for reality because those rules keep them sane, at least by traditional notions of sanity. I am not traditionally sane by any circumstance. I mean, I am functional in the sense that I get up and I work at a job. I write books and other things like that. And I have some level of functional awareness, although one could argue I could use more of that. But I am not by any means typically sane, because the fact of the matter is you're talking to a person who basically, quote unquote, communicates with spirits every day. Some people would say, oh, Taylor, you're schizophrenic or schizotypal or whatever. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, these experiences are very real, and I've seen real results. Nonetheless, you're not going to find most people who want to go to that level of work. And I will say you will even find some skepticism within the magical community. I mean, I've certainly experienced that before with some of the stuff that I've done or said. You know, I would say I had a person, I've had people say, well, like, okay, you've worked with spirits. Like, if the spirits really possessed you, I mean, has that really happened? Or is that just an act or what? Well, I mean, you tell me, are you willing to open yourself up to the spirits and see how they'll work through you? Because if you're willing to have that experience, then let's compare notes afterwards. If you're not, I mean, maybe it does seem a little dramatic and theatrical to you. And that's okay. I mean, you do you. But recognize that fundamentally, there is a level of experience that you are missing out on because it's much more convenient and safe and easy for you to stay within your lane. Whereas what I'm doing is I'm choosing to go outside the lane, go outside the coloring lines, if you will, and walk with the spirits in a very direct, mediated manner where I'm mediating them through me. And as a result, transforming who and what I am. And again, that comes with some quote unquote cost. There is a very real sense of that, I think. And I don't know that just anybody can do that. I think it does require a certain level of commitment and a willingness to basically say, yes, I'm willing to go outside the typical standards of society. I'm willing to be just somewhat different in a way that doesn't quite make sense, but nonetheless is relevant and real for me. Go with what's real for you. That's my recommendation. Well, thank you, Nick. I appreciate that you think I'm more sane because I acknowledge and respect the unknown. I would say that I am very comfortable with the unknown. In fact, I'm more comfortable with the unknown than I am with the known, because I find that the known is tedious in a lot of ways. It's very convenient. It works great for lots of people. It doesn't work great when you're a creative person. It doesn't work great. It doesn't work great when you're in a society that values functionality in certain ways over creative expression. But that's okay. That is part of the work that you just have to be willing to take on. And I don't think there's really been any period of time where the creative artistic genius has ever quite fully found a way to be easily accepted in society without there being some kind of transactional aspect involved. I mean, even when you look at the patronage of Renaissance Italy, for example, these artists who were basically had patrons. I mean, these artists, yes, they were allowed to be creative, but they had to be creative within very specific contexts as well. They were doing it at the whim of their patrons. And no, this isn't a bad thing. But when you look at like working with spirits, you look at magic, you look at anything along these lines, you have to ask yourself, like, why are certain things the way they are? And I think what's curious is that a lot of times when I look at like spirit work, for example, well, why do spirits show up as anthropomorphic spirits? Why are they humanicized? These things are not always. These things should be questioned more than they are, but they aren't. And so it becomes very convenient and easy to rely upon them. They become structures. And the problem with structures is that structures do not replace the need for genuine connection and relationship with the spirit or anything else. You have to open yourself to that and experience it. Of course, as a result, this also lends itself toward not necessarily fitting in very convenient, normalized ways. The normalized structures of humanity are not necessarily the same. And yes, Nick, that is true. There is a loner aspect to all of this, I think, on some level. I mean, certainly I've been a loner in some ways in my life, and I think that plays out in my own interactions. And maybe perhaps why I find it easier to interact with spirits in some ways than I do people. So there you go. All right. Anyway, this is my video about my approach to working with spirits. And hopefully you guys found it helpful and interesting. And hopefully it opened your mind and perspectives to the idea that you can work with spirits beyond the normative ways. that people typically find in Western occult practices.